I'd like to bring up next on the program a candidate for the United States Senate seat currently held by Hagan. He is Dr. Mark Harris. He hails from Charlotte, North Carolina, but spent a lot of time in Winston-Salem as well. If you would please welcome Dr. Mark Harris.
Well, good afternoon. It's great to see you all today, and count it a real privilege to be able to come and be a part of this event. And I heard a lot of great things about it, and I'm certainly honored to have been invited to be here today. And indeed, as Bill said, I do have the privilege of running across the state of North Carolina these days, crisscrossing the counties and the highways and the hedges to share with people a message that we believe is absolutely critical in this day in which we live. Let me tell you a little bit of my background, I think, to help you understand how I got here today. I'm a native of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, born and raised there. My mom was a kindergarten teacher, and my dad worked for Container Corporation of America, making corrugated boxes there in Winston-Salem. Graduated from high school, and when time came to go to college, chose Appalachian State University. And it was there, finishing Appalachian State University, when I had been accepted into law school, thought I was going to spend my life in public policy, that God called me to preach. And instead of law school that fall, I then made plans to attend Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. And for the last 26 years, I've had the privilege of serving in ministry. In fact, it was at age 22, the ripe old age, that I stepped into my first pulpit at Center Grove Baptist Church in Clemens, North Carolina. And for the next 11 years, had the privilege of walking through life with the men and women of that fellowship. For the last 8.5 years, I've had the privilege of serving as senior pastor of the First Baptist Church of Charlotte, North Carolina, and again, walking through life with the individuals in that church family. One of the things that's been very interesting in my journey is to recognize the same concerns that I heard in that first church as a 22-year-old young man, and through those 11 years at Center Grove, are many of the same concerns that I hear now, having been pastor of First Baptist Church Charlotte. And what I hear is concerns from people that make up that congregation, concerns about a sluggish economy in our nation, concerns about eroding values in our nation, concerns about the fact that we have a federal government that is encroaching on our lives each and every day. And maybe the greatest concern of all that I hear is that we're beginning to believe that we've got elected officials who just don't care anymore. Well, one of the reasons that I'm in this race is because I recognize that I do care. I care about families. I care about this nation. I care about your family. And this campaign that we have started and launched here is not going to be your typical political campaign. It's not about just scoring points or just doing this or doing that. But it's really about understanding the heart and soul of our nation and the need for something called real leadership in America once again. There is a longing for people to have leaders once again. One of the things that probably affected my life as much as anything was at the age of 14 years, I remember my parents dropping me off 3 days a week at the American for Reagan's office on Healy Drive in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Those 3 days a week, I had the privilege of stuffing envelopes and making phone calls. And as a result of all of that, had the privilege in 1981 of attending the inauguration of Ronald Reagan. One of the things that I think back on those days that was implanted in my heart and mind was really a very simple approach to American politics and American governance that Ronald Reagan laid out for us. He said, you know, American politics is really about building that three-legged stool. There must be a strong domestic agenda, there must be a strong foreign policy, and there must be strong traditional values. And if you try to weaken any one of those three legs, or you try to break off any one of those three legs, that stool cannot stand. I've been sharing with people across this state that that's been embedded in my heart. And should I be fortunate enough to land in the United States Senate representing the citizens of North Carolina, that will indeed be my commitment. You see, we need to once again understand a strong domestic agenda. A domestic agenda that understands that we must stand on the Constitution and the truth that it brings to us. We must understand the need for shrinking the federal government. And we must understand that we put a control on this federal government that encroaches into our lives. You see, the Constitution that we hold, you and I know, protects our right to speak freely. It reminds us again and again of our ability to worship God as we please. And it reminds us that citizens are able to own a gun without the concern of the government coming in and taking it away. We have a responsibility to look to our founding fathers and the sacred trust that they passed on to us. But you can't have a strong domestic agenda without understanding the need to shrink this federal government. All of us here this afternoon, I think, would agree that we have a federal government that wastes too much, that spends too much, that taxes too much. American families are literally taxed to death. And we have families today that find themselves continuing to struggle under the burden. And it's something that calls for real reform. We've got to put all of those issues on the table and once again understand that we have real tax reform that helps the middle class and uplifts small businesses here in our nation, because that's when we'll begin to see the free market be that economic engine that must drive this nation. You see, we need a strong domestic agenda that also recognizes the need to repeal Obamacare. I am grateful indeed for those who have stood strong in the United States Senate in recent days, even though they were only a handful. Because you see, they understood the seriousness of the issue in which we're facing. You see, they recognize the reality that we can't just put our heads in the sand and hope that somehow it'll get better. They recognize that we've got to, right now, the Congressional Budget Office tells us that by 2023, we'll be spending $3 trillion on health care in this nation. And to put that in perspective, that the whole federal spending previously has been $3.5 trillion. So in just a decade, which flies by just like that, we will find ourselves nearly doubling the expense of our federal government. And you and I know that is not sustainable. And we need leadership to continue to ring that alarm, and leadership that continues to speak truth into the hearts and minds of the American people. You see, we've got to recognize that strong domestic agenda and begin to step up and provide that leadership. But we also need to understand that three-legged stool involves a strong foreign policy. You and I have watched over the last 5-6 years as this president has almost single-handedly destroyed the reputation of America and its standing on the world stage. I say almost single-handedly because the Democrats in the United States Senate have sat by and watched it happen as well. We are living in a day where our friends, our allies, no longer know that we have their back. And our enemies seem to look at us with a mockery, and this whole notion of a foreign policy that we're going to lead from behind. Let's just be honest. We have a president and a Senate who have refused to lead, period. We must correct that. And we must have leaders that will stand and recognize that. Oh, listen. We've got to recognize that the only way we're going to have a strong foreign policy is with a strong military. A strong military that recognizes that when we have our strong military, we are able to know where we can draw red lines and where we cannot. Taking care of our military, those that are in harm's way, as well as those that are on our own soil now, but are protecting us. We must have that strong leg of a foreign policy, and we must remain that shining city on a hill. But then I would say the third leg of that stool is critical as well, and that is traditional values. You see, we must understand the traditional values in this nation, once again, of faith and of family. You see, they're critical because I'm convinced they are what make America work. And that's why I've stood for 26 years, not because of a political record, not because of political calculation, but because it's the core of who I am, that I've stood for the rights of the unborn child. I've stood for biblical marriage and the principles of marriage that are so critical to this culture in which we live. You see, we've got a junior senator in Washington, D.C. named Hagan, who holds a totally different vision for America. She has added to the problem by allowing this federal government to spin out of control. She's added to the problem by coming out, even after 61% of the people in this state voted for the marriage amendment. She came out and said that she supported same-sex marriage. She has come out 180 degrees opposed to that which is North Carolina values in her term in office. But I tell you this afternoon, at my core, as you get to know me, I'm still an optimist. I still at my core am an optimist, and I believe that there is a new day that is coming. I believe as I've crossed this state and have listened to the citizens of North Carolina that they once again recognize that it's time to restore hope and truth to the American government. See, I still believe in a day when the president will be able to speak and we can have confidence in his words. I still believe in a day when we'll have elected officials that are more concerned about doing what's right than they are about their next election. I still believe in a day where we will have Congress and leadership in the United States Senate that are more concerned about God and country than they are political party. You see, I believe that that day is right around the corner. And my hope is that we will be able to come together and to achieve that. Oftentimes when I share with groups, I share with them one of the key pieces that moved me into this race. And to tell you that, I have to tell you about a conversation I had with my father earlier this year. I went by to see my dad, who is bedridden at the current time. He's 89 years old, and I shared with him, Dad, I said, this is the toughest decision I've ever made in my life. And as only my dad could do, he looked at me and he said, son, just be careful. And I said, Dad, I want you to understand if I do this, I'm getting into this race because of you. He looked a bit perplexed, and I said, because Dad, you're my hero. You say, well, what, Mark, why is your dad your hero? Because my dad is the epitome of an overcomer. When I look at my dad, I see someone who at age 6 had his mom die with cancer. His dad was a drunk, couldn't take care of him, dropped him off by an aunt's house in High Point. And when he did, she realized she couldn't raise a 6-year-old boy, put him in the orphanage, the Methodist Children's Home. And there he graduated from high school and immediately went into World War II. He wanted to be a gunner. I wanted to be a pilot, but they had enough pilots, and so they made him a waist gunner on a B-17 plane. My dad flew 8 missions and didn't have to fire a single shot, but on his 9th mission, November 2nd, 1944, his plane was hit on their way back to the base, and all of them had to bail out. And when they did, my dad was immediately captured as they were over Holland, which was under German occupation, and he spent the last months of the war in a German prison camp. My dad was marched over 700 miles in those days. He went from a 175-pound soldier to 125 pounds when he was liberated. But I tell you that because when he came out, he fell in love with my mom. They got married. They raised 5 kids. And they built a home together, a family together, and a life together. I looked at my dad that day and I said, Dad, if I do this, I want you to understand that your generation, you understood something about America that our generation doesn't understand. You all saw America from this 30,000-foot view, and you recognize that everybody has to take risk. Everybody has to sacrifice. Everyone has to step up to the plate. And that's what made you the greatest generation. Our generation, we've been poor stewards of that sacred trust. And I believe it's time to put leaders in Washington, D.C. that understand once again what it means to see our nation from that 30,000-foot view, and understand once again that we must do what's right and we must do what's best. If you give me the privilege, I would love to go to Washington, D.C. and represent you in the United States Senate. A lot of folks speak about an America they love, but when I look at my parents, married 65 years before, almost 65 years before I lost my mom, and I look at the life that they lived, and I look at the life that they gave their children, I recognize with a clear heart that that is the America I love. That is the North Carolina I grew up in. That's the North Carolina I know and love. And should I have the privilege to represent you in the United States Senate, that's exactly what I intend to do. God bless you, and thank you for the opportunity to come and share with you this afternoon for a few minutes. I don't know if I got time for a question. Okay, I'm told I got a few minutes here if you've got a question. Yes, sir. All right, I got the swig.
A couple of questions.
Okay.
One, do you believe in the federal government? Can't hear you.
Is that mic on? They may have turned it off with the wind blowing. Oh, Dave's coming.
You got me, Dave?
There you go. He said lift it up a little bit. There you go.
Do you think that the federal government should be subsidizing unions to support workers, and do you think workers should be giving their monies to unions?
No.
So they can work. And would you support Israel and take away the funding to the Egyptians, Saudi Arabia, billions of dollars going there?
I am a firm believer in standing and supporting Israel, having been over there several times myself and led groups over there on a number of occasions. I recognize that they are our key ally in that entire part of the world, and they must know we have their back. And my great concern is that I think there's a lot of sleepless nights for Prime Minister Netanyahu right now because of what we have in the White House and in the United States Senate. And I would firmly stand for them. I feel like all foreign aid must be looked at each and every year. I think it's ridiculous to automatically have these countries think because they got money this year, they're set next year. I don't know about the way your business would operate or your home or the church that I pastor, but we have to do a budget every single year, and we have to revisit. And if we started revisiting and understand whether these people are our allies or are our enemies, we could make some much wiser decisions when it comes to that issue of foreign aid. And I would wholeheartedly call for the review of every individual expenditure with the foreign aid.
Pastor Harris, I enjoyed your words.
Thank you, sir.
Part of the reason why we gained our liberties and freedoms was because the British identified a major threat. We don't see them.
Hold the mic up a little bit, please. I'm sorry.
Part of the reason why I believe we gained our liberties and freedoms because the British identified a major threat to their effort, and they gave them the name of the Black Robe Regiment. If the British were here today, I don't believe they would see that threat coming from our pulpits in the country today. What are you seeing happening within the ranks of leadership within the church? And how can we, as lay people, see it even increase? Thank you.
That's a great question, William, and nobody saw that more than I did as a key leader on forming the coalition and the executive committee of Vote for Marriage NC. Because we were very dependent on pastors and spiritual leaders in the state of North Carolina to step up on this marriage issue when we dealt with it in 2012. It was shocking in many cases that we didn't find the pastors that were willing to step up. But what was encouraging, quite frankly, were identifying those that did. And I, quite frankly, in this race, am seeing the opportunity to activate an entire new political base, if you will, that Black Robe Regiment, who need to understand that we've got a serious issue. There's an issue in this nation that a lot of people don't understand, that for the first 166 years in this country, there was freedom in our pulpits. Freedom for pastors to speak on issues. Freedom for them to call out candidates and speak on political parties. But the Johnson Amendment that was passed in the 1950s began to put a cloud of doubt all over the pulpits in this nation. And until we have leaders that recognize that and are willing to challenge it, I was one of 1,200 pastors last year who went to my pulpit in October of 2012, delivered a sermon, and publicly endorsed Justice Paul Newby for the North Carolina Supreme Court because I believed it was critical for his election. Myself and the other 1,199 pastors in America sent a copy of our message to the IRS. That's something that the Alliance Defending Freedom have been challenging and encouraging pastors to do since 2008. And I am grateful that there is a growing movement and awareness among spiritual leaders that we can do it. The IRS doesn't even know what to do with that. And not one church has lost their tax-exempt status due to the fact of the pastors standing and challenging that. My First Amendment rights have been violated when I am told that I cannot get in my pulpit and share, "Thus saith the Lord God," and preach whatever I feel led to preach. And we need leaders that will call attention to that in this nation and awaken us once again. I think my time must be up. God bless you. Thank you for the privilege.